Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Now, I've been on something of a Star Wars kick recently. Now, my Star Wars 1/6 collection is relatively small. Part of the reason for that is because this is a universe that runs pretty deep, and I, as a collector, don't want to get sucked into buying them all. I simply could not afford it. There are, however, some key characters that I always knew I wanted to have in that collection. I already have the Darth Vader and the Return of the Jedi Luke Skywalker, and for me, that does represent Star Wars in quite a strong way. Of course, I would love a Han Solo at some point, and probably a Princess Leia to round out the set. But if I was tempted to expand the universe, then yeah, I think a Stormtrooper would make an appearance, and it would have to be Boba Fett as well, including perhaps some of the other bounty hunters. But you can see what I mean. Already this is starting to run away, and this could become quite an expensive collection if I'm not careful. But long story short, this is how my attention was drawn to Boba Fett. Now, this is the Hot Toys Boba Fett. It's not Sideshow, and it is, of course, Boba Fett from The Mandalorian Season 2. It's his Repaint Armour. I think it's important to draw that distinction because there are a couple of different variants on the market of this version of the character. For example, we do have this first appearance, which is a lot more battered. It has a lot more paint apps when it comes to the actual armour itself, a lot more scratched and worn, a little bit too busy for my liking. He also has the silver underlay, this sort of silver tunic, which for me just kind of clashes against the black of the pants, and I don't really quite like that. So that's why I steer clear of this one, although it does have some fantastic accessories, including a firing rocket and blast effects and knee firing rockets and all sorts of goodies. But for me, the version I really like is this repaint version, where the armor's a bit cleaner. It still has a little bit of scuffing here and there, as it should do, but it's a lot cleaner, it's a lot more vivid and bright, and I really like the contrast between the green and the black, and that is consistent all over. However, there's a variant here, as you can see, which comes with this very cool throne. I think it also comes with an alternate head, or an alternate figure, in fact, of the unmasked Boba Fett, the Boba Fett in his robes. Pretty cool stuff. Obviously, this is the deluxe version of this figure, but for me, I can't afford the deluxe. And to be honest, I don't have the space to display something as fancy as this. So for me, I'm quite happy with the standard release. So with all that said, let's take a look at the packaging for this special edition or standard release of Boba Fett's Repaint Armour. Okay, so what we have on the front of this packaging, obviously, is this very nice image here. It's very striking photography. They've done a really good job with this. And then around him is just essentially black borders. We do have a foil effect for the Star Wars logo and the name of the character, which is quite nice. And overall, this is quite presentable. I think this is quite striking and looks quite good on display. But if we flip it and look at the side panels, and indeed if we look at the reverse, we can see there's not really an awful lot else going on in this packaging. It is just black borders, and it's a little bit dull. Once we lift the lid, underneath we have this nice sort of placeholder, this sort of protective card, which is really nice. And I actually think this would have made a more striking image to put on either the side panel or the back of the packaging, or indeed even on the front, to be honest, because this looks absolutely brilliant. This lifts off, of course, and underneath we can see the figure in all his plastic glory and all of his various accessories there. And upon liberating the figure from the packaging, the first thing I had to say about this figure is that I was surprised by how light it was. I thought it'd be a bit heavier. I remember the Darth Vader Sideshow, for example, having a lot more weight, and I expected something similar here with Boba Fett, but he's actually incredibly lightweight, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is kind of interesting nevertheless. Now, if we look at the paint apps here, I think they've done a really nice job. I think the sculpting is really good, and of course the detailing there that we're getting through the paint is pretty much pitch perfect. I can't find anything to fault here. There's enough little details, and there's an awful lot of texturing going on as well. So I think, overall this looks pretty nice. I think they've done a good job with it. I particularly like how we've got the cloth collar there, ruffled up. This looks pretty much spot on, and I think it looks pretty nice all in all. All the proportions look to be accurate, as do the colour palette that's been used for the paint. And one of the things I really like about this, of course, is the articulation that we see on the helmet, where his little visor actually does flip down. Now, it's such a little thing, and it's the kind of thing you would expect, but I do think it's a nice touch, and I think it's really well realised here. Now, the armour on the figure only makes up a very tiny portion of the overall costume, which is kind of interesting. Each armour is actually a separate piece, a separate plate, which is individually sculpted and nicely painted, and I think they've done, a very good job here. What's really impressive is the way it's managed to stick to the cloth costume underneath. That is a really nice, thick, luxurious cotton material, but it's flexible enough to allow articulation. Looking at the reverse, we can see that this is one plate, one piece of armour for his back, and it's nice that there's actually a lot of paint paint apps going on here as well to show scuffing and damage, which is kind of interesting because for most of the time it is going to be covered up by the backpack. Something that is slightly strange about this backplate to me though is the fact that it has these sort of individual hooks or cutouts where it looks like the backpack would slot into. I'm not sure if they were experimenting with it with a clip function at some point, but actually the backpack relies on a magnet, so this seems entirely unnecessary really. It's a shame that this isn't more smooth. Of course, he has his shoulder pads with distinct markings, very fine paint apps here. I really like some of the dotting around the outside of the edge of this as well. Again, it just gives it that bit of texture, that lived in feel, a little bit of scuffing there as well. I think this looks really good, and it's quite impressive how this has been sewn into the costume, but there's absolutely no hint of that, so you can't see the join or the seam, and it just looks really neat. Of course, both gauntlets are completely unique. They have different looks and different sort of accessories attached to them. We have this firing rocket here, which sadly can't do anything with, but it still looks very cool. And again, the paint apps are nicely applied here, as you would expect. If we look at the gauntlet on the right arm, we can see individual prongs here, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You can see where one of mine is kind of curved a little bit here. That's because of the blast effect, which I'll show a bit later on. But the other thing I want to point out about this gauntlet is that you can see there are two individual sort of cotton wires coming out of this that actually hook in under his arm, which I suppose is meant to link to his backpack in some way. But again, it's very seamless, very smooth, and there's no hindrance here when it comes to articulation either. So this has been very well thought through and works an absolute treat. I'm probably most impressed by the belt on this figure because these pouches actually look like leather. The way they've painted these is really convincing, but it is in fact actually just plastic. And I should note they don't open. But this is very, very well done because we have these plastic pieces on this leather-bound belt, creating some different levels of texture, and somehow they've managed to make it look seamless, which is really, really impressive. Then underneath that belt, we actually have this cotton ribbon as well. This is great. This just feels really textured, really layered, and it just is wonderful detail. And attached to the belt and wrapped around his leg, we have this leather pouch gun holster as well with a magnet with the actual strap, and we'll see how that works a little bit later on with the actual blaster. Looking at his boots, we can see they've opted for two pieces, one for the main shaft of the boot, and then of course a piece for the actual foot itself to allow some articulation. I think this works really well. It's not too noticeable. It looks fairly seamless, and I think they've done a good job with this all in all. Again, we can see some sort of mud spattering effect in terms of the paint as well, which is quite subtle but very effective, and I think they've done a nice job of this. So I think this looks pretty cool all in all. And if we flip it and look at the underneath of the shoe there, we can see the sole of the shoe. We can even see some gripping there, which is quite nice. Again, a little bit extra detail that you wouldn't think to look at necessarily, but really nice that they've thought through and included. My only very, very minor gripe, and it is nitpicking, is that the yellow shin pad, whilst beautifully sculpted and very nicely painted again with all the scuffing that you'd hope to see, it is, as you can see, held together with this elastic band. And if you look at the back of the leg, you can see that it's a little bit noticeable, and it's a shame that we couldn't have had that cloth kind of come down over this to obscure this a little bit more. But hey, it's unlikely that you're going to actually have this on display like this. He does have that lengthy black skirt, which does a nice job of actually covering that. So as I said, this is really just nitpicking. Now, I did want to draw your attention to the stand that the figure comes with. The one thing I like about this is the metal plaque. I think that works really well. It catches the light nicely, and it looks pretty good. The actual base itself feels a little bit flat, and, well, quite literally, in fact. It just feels a bit nondescript. Doesn't feel particularly Star Wars-like. It just feels like it's lacking a little bit of interest, really, which is a shame. Time to look at the articulation. He does have what appears to be a ball joint in the neck, allowing the head to spin all the way around. Lean left and right, a pretty healthy distance, a surprising distance, I have to say. And of course, he can also nod his head forwards a good distance, and, a little bit back as well. Not quite as much as I would like, but nevertheless, good range of motion here for a big helmet. Now, if we pull the helmet off, we can kind of see what's going on here. We can see, yes, there is a ball joint at the base of the neck, and then we have this rather weird foam looking thing which holds the helmet in place. Of course, this would be swapped out for the alternate head if you had the deluxe edition. Now, if anyone's ever had a burning desire to see what the underneath or the inside of Boba Fett's helmet looked like, well, now's your chance, because Hot Toys have taken the opportunity to give us a little bit of detail and insight here, which they didn't need to do, and I think this is a nice little touch. We can see the foam padding inside here, which actually looks pretty cool, so I do give them top marks for that. Of course, the figure has ball joints in the shoulders, and thankfully, even though he has the pads there, there's no hindrance here to him being able to lift his arms fully up and out, which I really appreciate, and he's able to even spin the arm around thanks to a bicep swivel there as well. And as you can see, through the use of a butterfly wing joint, he's able to really swing his arms forwards and backwards here. Now, he does have a double joint in the elbow. This does sort of come into conflict between his various plastic pieces in terms of the armour, so he can't get his hand all the way back to his helmet, which is disappointing. And when it comes to the articulation that he has in the wrist, he does have a ball joint here. He can spin his hand all the way around, and he can hinge it forwards and backwards a little bit, but it is massively hindered by this gauntless piece, and that's something to be mindful of. Now, there's a ball joint in the waist that will allow him to spin from side to side. Mine is a bit restricted, I've got to be honest, and I think that's because of the various layers that he has around his waist. So he can lean left and right, and he can bend forwards and backwards a little bit as well, but not as much as I was hoping for, in all honesty. And I was a bit disappointed by the limitations here. There are ball joints in the hips though, so the legs will kick out to the side. Also, there is a swivel at the top of the thigh there that will allow you to move the leg from side to side as well. Of course, the leg will kick forwards and it will kick backwards. Now, not a huge range of motion here, or at least I don't want to push the boundaries of this and risk snapping anything. What it does have is a very nice ratcheted knee joint. There's a double joint here, and you can ratchet the lower leg up and it feels nice and secure and solid. And then finally, there is what appears to be a ball joint at the ankle, allowing the foot to kind of wobble side to side and hinge forwards and backwards, but it's quite minimal. Okay, time for my favourite bit, which is the accessories, and I'm pleased to say that this version of Boba Fett comes with quite a few goodies all his own, including an additional 4 hands. So he's got 2 closed fists, and then he's got a couple of gripping hands as well for his special weapons. He also has 2 very cool holograms, one of the Razor Crest and one of Slave One. These are really nice, unexpected pieces. He has this grapple hook, this flame effect, pistol, his blaster rifle, and of course, his jetpack, which comes in 2 parts. Now, if we look at this main trunk, we can see this is very nicely sculpted, and there's some beautiful paint apps here as well. This looks really finely detailed, and it looks, pretty screen accurate, which I really like. Then of course he also has the individual rocket piece, which is a separate piece. Now, we do know that in terms of the deluxe version, there's various blast effects here to show it firing. That isn't the case with this version. This just slots in there. It's fairly stiff actually to get it into place, and then it locks in. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a magnet that allows the backpack to just slot into place. I absolutely love this. I think this works really, really well. What works less well is the grapple hook and the flame effects, which is quite complicated. This took a lot of faffing about, where you have to take the hands off, you then have to slide the accessory into the gauntlet, you have to be careful as you reattach the hand into place, and all the while there's a risk, particularly with this gauntlet piece here, that it might just snap. It doesn't feel like there's a designated place for it to just comfortably sit, and the blast effect is even worse. As you can see, and I mentioned earlier, that actually some of the individual hooks on his gauntlet here actually got bent out of shape a little bit as I was trying to apply this, and this effect is just a bit monstrous really. I will not be displaying it with this in future because it's just too much of a chore to get this right, and I feel like I might break the figure in the process. It's a shame because it's a really cool looking thing, but I just wish there was a better way of them kind of attaching this, an easier way that was more smooth and seamless. This just feels very precarious, and that's a shame because it's such a great idea, and I think it looks absolutely brilliant. Once you do persevere and you get a shot like this, it looks really awesome. I just wish it was easier to assemble, and as I said, for me, I won't be using this again. Likewise, I also found the hologram to be a disappointing faff as well, and it wasn't really secure. It felt like it was constantly wobbling around, as you can see here, and it was a bit of a nightmare having to change these over. It's a shame they couldn't have done something with magnets here to kind of attach these pieces onto the actual gauntlet itself, or actually have a hook, a hole, a peg hole somewhere on the gauntlet to just slide these into, because relying on it kind of sitting into the groove there, it's not tight, and it just doesn't work, unfortunately. Now, it's a shame because again, it looks awesome. I think it's a really great idea, and when you look at the various bits and pieces, whether you're looking at Slave One or the Razor Crest, it's a really awesome visual if you get it right and you're willing to put the time in to get it right. But as you can see here, it just kind of wants to flop out all the time, and although the end result is cool, I just don't have the patience for it. The blaster is really nicely sculpted. There's some nice paint apps here, particularly the grip on the stock there, and I think they've done a really good job of it. Now, I have to be honest, I found this a little bit tricky to get into his grip initially. It's a very, very tight grip, I will give it that. There's no danger of this escaping his hand, but it's a little bit awkward to get into place because it's very, very tight, and the stock of the weapon there is actually quite thick. So this involved a lot of prying and trying to just wedge it into place, which felt a little bit uncomfortable at times. Didn't want to snap anything, but once it is firmly in his grip, I have to say it does look the works, doesn't it? It looks really, really cool, and I think they've done, a nice job with how this looks. Again, I wish the thing was maybe a softer rubber than a hard plastic, because I found this to be a bit of an ordeal. But it is worth it because you can strike many different cool poses with this particular weapon, and I think, he holds it fantastically. And of course, he can slide it into his pouch. I did mention there is a magnet there, and I love this. I think that works so well. And of course, you can just slide the blaster into place there, into the holster, and then just secure it with that magnet on the strap. I think that's beautiful. I love this. And then finally we have the blaster rifle, and I really like this weapon because of course it is recycled from the original Star Wars films, and it doesn't have this in that first appearance armor, the one with the slightly more tatty armor and the silver underlay that I mentioned, and that was another reason why I wanted this version, because I really love this weapon. I think it's iconic. So I was really keen to make sure he had this. Now again, I was slightly disappointed because he doesn't really hold it that securely in his grip. He's got this specific gripping hand here where his finger goes through the trigger, but it's quite a loose grip, as you can see, and he can hold it with both hands, and really you're going to need to do this in order for it to feel comfortable, to feel like it really belongs in his grip. Otherwise, it just feels too loose, like it's just going to fall free from his hands. And yeah, I wish those three fingers weren't so elongated, and they actually had more of a gripping element to them. Again, maybe a soft rubber there just to kind of grip the weapon more securely. As it is, it just doesn't look quite right, and maybe this is me, maybe I'm posing it wrong, maybe I'm putting it in the wrong hands even, I don't know, but it doesn't ever look quite right, and it doesn't feel secure, which is a shame. Alright then, final thoughts from me in quick summary. I've got mixed feelings about this figure. There's parts of it that I really, really like. I think the overall presentation is spot on. I think the colours, the paint apps that we have are really nicely and finely applied. I think the tailoring for the most part is pretty spectacular. I particularly like the use of different textures in this figure, which works really, really well. I think the accessories are really fun and well intentioned, and they get top marks for that. And the articulation scheme is pretty solid. It's not the best I've ever seen, but there's a huge range here, and I'm pretty convinced you can get him into a lot of different poses as you want, which is fantastic. And all in all, yeah, it's a pretty nice, solid figure. I think it's a fantastic representation for Boba Fett in terms of my collection. So overall, yes, I'm very, very happy with it. There are some noticeable disappointments with it, though, that I have to comment on. The first one, as I mentioned at the top of the video, is the fact that, well, it does feel quite light, and I thought he would feel a bit heavier, have a bit more weight to him. I also feel a little bit let down when it comes to the accessories. As I said, they're really well intentioned. The accessories themselves are fantastic, but there's a big distinction between the intention and the execution, and I think that's where it falls down here, is actually being able to use these accessories is a bit of a chore, and it shouldn't feel like that. And of course, the base is a little bit underwhelming, to say the least. But all that being said, for the most part, as a figure that you can put on display to round out your Star Wars collection, you could do far worse than this version of Boba Fett. I really like the look of it, and I think, he's got some fun elements here to make him well worth your time. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please do consider giving the video a like. That kind of thing really does help the channel out, and it allows me to keep making more content. And if you're interested in seeing more content, remember to hit subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos coming soon.